Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to another module on Introduction to Machine Learning. Today we will talk about neural networks, which is a very important topic in machine learning. A whole set of revolution in deep learning, in artificial intelligence that we are currently witnessing is based on neural networks. So this topic is going to be foundational for deep neural networks that we will briefly look at in this course later, and perhaps in a more advanced course later on. So let's get into it. So the learning objectives for this module are going to be how we will explain how adding hidden layers increases the modeling ability of neural networks compared to linear models, including linear regression and linear classification. We will write the mathematical expression of the sort of functions that neural networks model, and then we will derive method to train neural networks, which is called backpropagation algorithm, which is used quite widely even in deep learning. And then we'll list some ways to improve the training of neural networks using backpropagation, how to make backpropagation more robust and faster. So let's look at a hierarchy of models that we have been looking at until now. So on the left hand side are more simpler models, simpler in the sense that the type of functions that they model are going to be simpler. They are going to be restricted, whereas on the right hand side we have more complicated functions and more sophisticated layered structures of functions. So if you think about any input x, right, and if we send it to a linear regressor, we send that input to a linear regressor or a linear classifier, what that does is it extracts some linear features from this x, or basically it multiplies it with some linear weights for each of the dimensions of x, and then depending on whether it is regression or classification, in regression nothing else, we do nothing more after that, we just, that is the model, the weights times the input dimensions is actually what the output is. But if it is a classification problem, then we might send it to a pseudo step function or the sigmoid function, and the output of the sigmoid function we will interpret it as either a class 0 or a class 1 or a combination thereof of multiple class 0s and class 1s for multi-class classification. So with all that, what we get is an output f of x, and this function f of x is trainable. What is trainable is shown in the subsequent slides in red color. So what is actually trainable is this weight matrix W, right, and I'm not using biases because I assume that it's an augmented x vector. We have appended a 1 to it, and then the weight, one of the weights can act as the bias. So to simplify notations, I'm just excluding all the biases. So now for this particular form of a function, we will get f of x, which is just W matrix multiplied by the x vector, which is vector for one particular input sample, right. So or we can also call it xi. So we multiply the matrix W with x, and that is our output, or we put it in a linker function like a sigmoid function sigma, and that's our output. So that output, once we get it here, we compare it with the desired values t or t sub I, and we compare it inside a loss function, and basically your entire flow is such that the input goes into the linear classifier or regressive where it gets multiplied with W, and if it is a regression then nothing else happens, but if it is classification we also send it through a fixed function sigma, and whatever comes out of that, which is y is equal to fx or y is equal to sigma w wx, that is compared with Ti, and that could be a mean square error comparison, or it could be a cross entropy comparison depending on the problem, and based on that we will compute a derivative of the loss with respect to the weights W and send it back to slightly adjust W, so that when we do many iterations of these slight adjustment we get to the optimal W that will minimize the loss. And in this minimization of loss I am also assuming that the regularization is there. So if you are doing L2 regularization, this loss, this gradient for adjustment will also have the gradient of the regularization term in the loss, in not just the error loss but the regularization loss as well. So that is basically what we have learned until now for linear models, and slightly more sophisticated form of that is support vector machines. In support vector machines we will take the input but we will extract fixed features. So you can also think of extracting fixed features in terms of problems such as polynomial regression. So if you have x which is a single scalar, then fixed features could be x squared, x cubed and so forth. So now you have multiple terms, multiple powers of x, but you are still computing a linear combination of those for the output, and we are basically just computing the loss again just like we were doing for linear regression. For support vector machines it's slightly more sophisticated than a simple feature extraction and loss computation. Here the feature extraction happens over pairs of inputs as opposed to a single input. So we have a kernel function, and that kernel function will take your test vector or another training vector xj and compute the kernel with respect to one of the training points xi, and depending on whether this xi is a support vector or not, the coefficient would be either 0 or non-zero. So this coefficient ai will be 0 for non-support vectors and it will be non-zero for support vectors, which will also be computed as a part of the loss function, and we will have that hinge loss function plus a regularization term over the L2 loss of all the weights. So based on that we basically again compute the loss, and we can either do gradient descent or quadratic programming in this case, and we will adjust the AIs or the W's for such a model also. So now we have gone from just a simple linear model to extracting non-linear features, but the computation, the loss computation and the gradient over the loss is still over finally a linear model of their inputs, right. So it is still it's only slightly more non-linear in that sense compared to the linear models. So what we will talk about going forward is about neural networks where you have the input x, right, and then we will extract some trainable features from that, and let's say those trainable features are w1, some matrix w1 times x, and we will put a non-linearity to it, sigma w1 times x, right, and on top of that we will have another linear regression or classification. So this is your first layer of feature extraction, and this entire vector that we extract, that we compute from the input, becomes an input to the next layer. So this is your layer 1 and this is your layer 2. Okay, so it becomes an input to the next layer which has its own set of weights. So your W1 is residing here, your W2 is residing here, and then again we will compute a loss, and this loss need not be very different from these losses. It can be as simple as mean square error for regression problems and cross entropy for classification problems, but that loss will now be computed over an output. This output is again f of x, but the form of f of x is slightly more complicated than the previous form that we saw for linear models. Here the form of x is such that it has layers of functions within functions, right, and we can actually extend it to multiple layers, more than 2 layers. So what we will have is we have x, and then what we compute, so we have w1 here, what we compute here is sigma of w1 times x, right, and then we have another layer where we will have w2, and then we will have sigma of w2 times sigma of w1x, etc. And then we have finally have the weight of the last layer, which is the lth layer, so wl for the lth layer, and from there we will have the final layer of weights that will be multiplied with the previous set of features that were extracted. So we will have a very large equation, very large layered function, where it will be a function of functions of functions of functions. So there will be functions nested inside functions, but the form of each function remains fundamentally the same, that we have a linear weight matrix multiplying with the input vector, and that input vector is the output vector of the previous layer, right. So the output vector of the previous layer becomes the input vector of the current layer, and then on top of that we have a nonlinear function sigma, and this nonlinear function we have a lot of flexibility over that, and we will look at some good examples of this nonlinear function sigma. It need not always be sigmoid, although sigmoid is also a decent choice of a function that can be used throughout for nonlinearity. So basically that's in a nutshell what is neural networks. We will concentrate this lecture on a single hidden layer neural network, but if you add number of hidden layers and you have special layer structures that are easier to train, then we get deep neural networks. So it just builds upon the same concept. So in some sense we have to think of it as you have x, and then we can multiply this with some weight matrix w, right, and what we get out of that we can send it to some nonlinear function sigma, and this function sigma is applicable. You don't use it for linear regression, but let's say for classification we use it, right, and basically what we get here is the loss term after that, right, because the loss term also takes t and it computes the difference between these two. We are just making it slightly more sophisticated when we are computing, when we are basically extracting, let's say, some feature phi, right, and then we multiply it with some weights w, right, and then we may or may not have a sigma, but then we have a loss after that, again computed with t. So that is roughly the structure of how things work for support vector machines, or for polynomial regression where we are extracting fixed set of features. What is happening in neural networks, it's slightly different, is that we are taking these the input, multiplying it with some weights w1, okay, and then sending it to a layer, to a nonlinearity sigma. Whatever we get out of that we multiply it with w2, okay, send it to another layer sigma, and this continues until we get the output, and then again we compare it to a loss function, and we compute a loss function by comparing it against the target t. Okay. So that's basically the difference between this layered increase in complexity of models for neural networks. So this is another representation of the same thing to reinforce the same concept, that your inputs and outputs are going to be vectors in neural networks, at least when we are looking at it now. Later on we can think of them as higher dimension than just one, just a single dimensional array. We will look at tensors later on, but for now let's assume all your inputs and outputs are vectors, and when we are transforming them within the layer we will use matrices for weights. So a matrix times a vector will get another vector, and that will become the output of that layer. So if you don't have any model fx is equal to x, if you have a linear model or a generalized linear model, then your fx is equal to sigma some function, nonlinear function sigma of w1 times x. Again, I'm not using the bias, assuming bias is one of the extra dimensions of input that is added at each layer, that is appended or concatenated at each layer. Now if we add one hidden layer, then this will be the first layer of the neural network that will transform the inputs using a linear multiplication and a nonlinear function on top of that. Then we will multiply another weight and another nonlinear function, and that will basically give us the second layer of the neural network. So that's adding one layer. If we add multiple layers, then this is your first layer, this is your second layer, etc. This is L minus 1th layer, and this is your Lth layer, and that is just a more complicated function. That's pretty much it. And we can also think of loss as another layer, where all this how you can see the layers is that there's a function inside a function. So we can take this entire function and put it inside the loss function, and that makes the loss also as another layer. So when we train, what training means is that we want to find the derivative of loss with respect to any particular weight, let's say weight j, right, j k. So because it's a matrix, so we will take the jth matrix, kth, or let's say the ith, sorry, small l, lth matrix for lth layer, and then the matrix will have two components that will be, let's say, I and j. Okay. So we will represent all the weights using three indices, one for the layer and the other for the position in the matrix, the row position and the column position in the matrix. So now we want to be able to find the derivative of the loss with respect to any particular weight, and the way it will be done is using chain rule of derivatives, and a particular way of storing intermediate outputs of your chain rule is basically what backpropagation algorithm is, that we will look at little later in this lecture. So where did this idea of neural networks come from? So it basically had inspiration in the structure of biological neurons, right. So in biological neuron you have a nucleus, cell nucleus, and there is a cell body around it, right, and then there is a very large fiber that goes from that body, and that is called the axon, right. So basically this axons, these fibers are what makes our nerves, and at the end of the axon, what we have are these connections which are connected to other neurons, right. And similarly this particular axon takes inputs from other neurons that might be around it. So what you can see is that, so these structures are called dendrites. What we can see is that each cell by itself is simple, okay. It has a simple structure and it is repeated, the same simple structure is repeated, but it can do complex tasks when several billions of these cells are put together in a certain structure. It can do all the tasks, for example the sensing that we do using our eyes, the sensing that we do using our nose, using our ears, and then the thinking process that goes on inside our brain, the sensing from our touch, and then the motor control of controlling our muscles in response to these stimuli, planning for the motion, planning for the control, walking upright, which is a very difficult problem if you take just a stick figure and make it into a human form with different joints that can move. It's very difficult to keep it stable upright, but we do it right from around 1 year old all the way up to a few years before we die. We can control our motion for standing up and walking and running and playing basketball and whatnot. So all that is controlled by a network of neurons which are by themselves very simple cells, but when they are connected together, the information, the knowledge resides in the connection. Knowledge resides in two things. One is structure of connections, and the strength of connections. Okay, so that is basically the power of Mother Nature, that over several million years of evolution, it repurposed several simple cells, connected them, and made us into a conscious being that is able to dominate on its environment, and able to control other species to the extent that we are eliminating several species to our own detriment, and it can perform several tasks. It can think about spirituality, it can think about science, it can think about various other things and so forth. So several years ago in the 50s and 60s, scientists such as McCullough and Pitts, they started thinking about how can we model these biological neurons using simple mathematical functions, and that gave rise to the artificial neurons that were inspired by real neurons. So basically the neural networks are networks of these artificial neurons, and they're somewhat like the human brain or the mammalian brain. And the simple structure that can be thought of is the following. So let's say you have a particular input dimension x1, you have another input dimension x2 and x3. We multiply them with their individual weights w1, w2 and w3. So whenever you see an arrow and something on top of that, so basically this input is being multiplied, and the output is basically k times x. So that's a convention when you show these signal diagrams, and with that convention basically w1 and x1 is getting multiplied, w2 and x2 is getting multiplied, w3 and x3 is getting multiplied, and the bias is multiplied with 1. So basically what we get here is wi times xi plus b, right? And then so that is the output that we get here, and that is sent into a nonlinear function. So let's call it z. So what we get out here is sigma of z. Okay, so that's the simple structure of a neuron, of an artificial neuron, and it is quite similar to what a biological neuron does. Let me not say that it's quite similar, but it's a simplification of what a biological neuron does. So in a biological neuron you have the cell nucleus, and then you have the cell body, and then you have the axon, and these are the connections, and these other neurons that you have in the vicinity, they give off some neurotransmitters as signals to them, and depending on the strength of the connection, so this particular connection may be for another neuron, and depending on the strength of the connection, whether it is positive or negative, we have inhibitory for negative, and positive are excitatory signals, and there are different strengths of excitation, different strengths of inhibition. So those signals, how frequently these cells fire, depending on the strength of the signal, there will be a potential which is basically a change in voltage, and that voltage gets communicated to the cell. If it exceeds a threshold, then this neuron will fire, and whatever is the downstream neuron, that neuron will get affected, that will get a signal from this neuron. So what this function does is basically it acts as a threshold to see whether this neuron should fire or not, and what we know from our previous mathematics is that if this is your input z, then sigma of z, one way to model this potential is to model it using a threshold function, and that threshold function is going to be a step function. Okay. So this step function basically decides whether the neuron is off or on. So that's a simple idea of a neural network. Later on we will see that these steps are not very useful to us, because we want to learn and we want to get some directional signal, and that directionality is just not there in the flat regions. So for that we need some slopes for gradient descent, and that's why we don't use these step functions, just as what we don't use them in logistic regression. So in some sense neural networks are a generalization over logistic regression that we will see later. So what is the role of this activation function? So this step function is called activation function, or whatever function that we put, whatever nonlinear function we put here is called activation function. Okay, so it could be a step function like this, it could be sigmoid like this, and so forth. The idea of these step functions is that if we have layers upon layers of these neurons and we did not have any nonlinearity, then basically we need not have many layers. Effectively we are just modeling linear functions of linear functions, and those are not they can be collapsed into a single linear function. To give you an example, so let's say you have a matrix W2 and it is being multiplied with matrix W1 times X, right. So basically let's say we have another matrix which we call W3, which is basically the multiplication of the two matrix, then this f of x is as good as f of x is equal to W3 times X. So this again is a linear function. So by having multiple layers we did not gain anything new. In fact we added ambiguity into by having two matrices multiply with each other. So because of that we never have, even for regression we never have just linear layers. Some of the layers last but one layer, so except for the last layer every other layer has to have a nonlinearity, and that nonlinearity comes from this activation function which is sigma. So only with this activation function do we have some interesting functions that we can model. In a perceptron this is going to be a step function, right. Here in neural networks we will, or in logistic regression we had the sigmoid function, and in neural networks we will have more choices. So if you are doing classification with neural networks, the last layer is going to be sigmoid or softmax, which is a n-dimensional generalization of sigmoid, and for regression we'll just have a linear layer, but the any layer below the last layer is not going to be linear. It will have, this function is not going to be an identity function, it's going to be some nonlinear function. So let's go back to logistic regression, see how it is being modeled by a single neuron. So let's say we have input dimensions x1, x2 and x3, and for fun let's also add a bias for 1, and we multiply all of these with weights w1, w2, w3 and b, and we add all of them up and we put that inside a sigmoid function. So when we add all this up, let's say we get z, which is a linear combination of all the x's and the bias, and then we basically compute 1 by 1 plus e to the power minus z, and that is the nonlinear function. The output that we get is the logistic regression over the input dimensions x1, x2 and x3, or the logistic function on top of that, and that's basically the model of a single neuron. So we already know what a single neuron looks like when we studied logistic regression. So how is this logistic regression trained? Whatever output that we get, right, so this is 1 by 1 plus e to the power minus z, we compare that against some target value t, and that comparison is put in a loss function, and then we take the derivative of the loss function, and that derivative is in some sense sent back, and then from there it is sent back to all the three weights, and based on that we adjust the weights slightly. So basically what we are saying is that w1 is going to take the value of whatever w1 was in the previous iteration, so let's call it t plus 1, or iteration, let's call it n plus 1th iteration, and it was whatever it was in the nth iteration plus some learning rate eta, minus some learning rate eta times the gradient of the loss with respect to W1, right. So that is the update equation for the first weight, and similarly we have an update equation for the other 3 weights as well as the bias. So this is how it was being trained by logistic regression. And what is L? L is the cross entropy loss that we have already looked at. Now we can actually have multiple outputs, right. So we can have, for example, multi-class output. So let's say you are given a picture of an animal, and these are some characteristics that are extracted from that picture, and we want to classify it into 2 different types of categories, which is flies and cannot fly, right. Flies versus cannot fly. So that is one binary classification. The other is mammal or bird, right. So you have ostriches that are birds that cannot fly. Ostriches and emus are birds that cannot fly, and then you have bats and flying foxes, which are also another kind of bats, which are mammals that can fly. So let's say we have all 4 combinations of fly and cannot fly, mammal and bird, and what we can see is that there could be features that are important to both problems. So for example, has fur, doesn't have fur is important to both problems. Has feather, doesn't have feather is important to both problems, and then has wings, doesn't have wings is important to both problems. So these could be your inputs that are extracted using either like some tabulation or something along those lines, and based on that we want to reuse those inputs for 2 different problems. Now we will have 2 different weights. So now you can see that the weight is no longer a weight vector but a weight matrix, right. So we have 1 vector here and we have 1 vector here, so the weight is going to be a matrix now, okay. And similarly our loss is going to be a loss over the first classification plus a loss over the second classification, and they could be different weights for the 2 classifications. You can have a loss for the first classification plus lambda times loss for the second classification plus lambda 2 times L2 norm of weights for regularization. So now we have 3 weights here and 3 weights here, so we will get a matrix that will be, so if your X is of dimension 3 cross 1, we are going to have a weight matrix that is of dimension 2 cross 3, so that the output that we get, the Z output that we will get will be of dimension 2 cross 1, okay. And then we will take the sigmoid over that, and that will give us the Y, which is also going to be of dimension 2 cross 1, okay. So now you can see that your weight becomes a matrix. So if you have m dimension here, n dimension here, then you get m cross n, right. So that's how we are transforming from m dimensions to n dimensions by using an n cross m dimensional matrix. But this can be done, is what I wanted to show. Previously we did not talk about multiple classifications, but that's how we will generalize from logistic regression onward to multiple classifications. So now what is the concept of layers? Why do we have layers in neural networks? So again, let's go back to biology a little bit. So let's talk about the mammalian visual cortex. So let's say we have a stimulus, okay. So let's say this is a tree, and we have eye of a mammal. So this is the lens, and this lens will focus it on the retina. So what is retina? Retina is a layer of photosensitive cells within our eye, and these photosensitive cells acts like the pixel elements, the picture elements on the sensor of a camera, such as a CCD or a CMOS camera, which is where each bucket is computing the light intensity falling in one particular small location, and that is the resolution. That small location defines the resolution of the image that you will get. And similarly, we have a retina. It's slightly different from the camera sensors, in the sense that camera sensor has uniform spacing of these elements throughout, whereas in our eye we have a sensitive central region called fovea, and then we have less sensitive surrounding area which forms our peripheral vision. So all our reading has to be in the fovea, whereas we are aware of gross movements around the fovea, but we cannot read outside our fovea. Anyway, so all these cells are basically specialized nerve cells, specialized photoreceptors, and they give their signal to some nerve cell which is called the optic nerve. This optic nerve goes into a layer of neurons, and that first layer of neurons is called V1. This set of neurons, what it does is it looks at the pixel elements that are in any location and their relation to its surrounding pixel element. So think about it this way. So if what is important for us to recognize shapes, and shapes that are crucial to our survival, are things such as dangerous animals and food, right? And for these, to recognize these things, we need to recognize shapes. So let's say this is a fruit, right? What distinguishes a fruit from its surroundings is the edge of the fruit, right? So there's a particular shape that is the edge of the fruit. Now if the image of that edge is falling over the retina, over this region of the retina, one side of it is going to be dark and the other side is going to be light, right? So these edges are defined by certain regions of darkness and lightness that fall in certain spatial arrangements. So here the spatial arrangement is that if we draw a vertical line, the left side is light, the right side is dark, whereas at the bottom the top side is dark and the bottom side is light, and then we can have diagonal edges and so forth all along the image. So we have specialized cells in V1 that detect different oriented edges. Some detect vertical edges, some detect horizontal edges, some detect diagonal edges and so forth. Some detect dots, dot is basically darkness surrounded by lightness or lightness surrounded by darkness. Right? So these dots are important for recognizing dangerous snakes, or not sure how they came into the cortex, but they are definitely useful. We enjoy lots of beautiful patterns, if not just, if we are not worried about survival yet, but we got to this point of enjoyment because we have figured out survival by having a very complex visual cortex and an overall brain. So here the first layer is V1, which basically detects dots and bars and these edges, and then we have another layer which is V2. So all the inputs from here are sent to V2, which is another set of neurons, and these in V2 what we have is we look at combinations of edges to find corners and shapes and so forth. Similarly, we have V3, V4, etc., and then it goes into a very complicated information extraction later on in the visual cortex. But the first few layers are better understood because they extract simple features. So there are few key concepts here. First is that the kind of features that are being extracted, they are simple. Okay, so lower layers are simple. Lower layers extract simple concepts. Okay. And then higher layers extract more complex context, and higher layers even do higher level thinking for us. Higher layers or deeper layers, let's say higher or deeper, extract more complex concepts. Other things are that the kind of work that is done in the lower layers, that is usually self-repeating. There are different positions on the retina where we want to extract edges, but it's the same type of edge that we extract in different locations. But later on, once we are looking at different concepts such as fruit or a tiger or a snake or a desirable mate or whatever that is, that becomes slightly more specialized, and it is not like a self-repeating pattern. It's perhaps only one neuron is responsible for assessing danger, one for assessing, or a group of neurons, a small group of neurons is for assessing food and so forth and so forth. So there's a layered structure. The layer also means that the information flows this way, but the information does not come back. Okay, so that's an important concept of a layer, that the information goes deeper into the neural network, it does not come back. And another important concept of the layer is that within the layer there is not much information exchange very far from the location of the neuron. So if we extract an edge, we only need to look at a small region, we don't need to interact with what is going on far away in the field of the view. So that information exchange only happens very locally, if at all. We will look at it in convolution neural networks, that's the concept of a convolution. But for the current topic, we are not even looking at any exchange of information within the same layer. So all information exchange happens goes from the lower layer to the upper layers or the deeper layers. We will see that during training the information also comes back from deeper layers to the lower layers, but for now, just for processing the information, not for training, just for processing the information, for inference, it just flows one way. Now let's look at a single hidden layer in a neural network, what exactly it does. So we already looked at, let's say these are the inputs and these are the outputs. Now instead of having a direct connection between the inputs and the outputs through a single nonlinear function, let's add a layer, and then instead of sigma I'm using g and f here, but it's the same idea. We are just using a different notation. So now we have added this layer. So you can see that first of all there is no interconnection between layers, so that is not there, and there is no skipping of layers, and there is no connection that is coming back from a previous layer. So it's not arbitrary connection of neurons, it's only a layer wise connection of neurons. So here all the neurons here are connected to all the neurons here, and then all the neurons here are connected to all the neurons here. So that's the structure, basic structure of a neural network. It's for several reasons why this is the basic structure as opposed to an arbitrary set of nodes and connections. So let's say if you have an arbitrary set of nodes and connections and anything can be connected to any other node, that would be another way of having a neural network. But this particular layered structure has advantages in the sense of from the point of view of analyzing how they behave. For training them, there are no loops when you are doing the training and passing the gradients around and so forth. So these are directed acyclic graphs. Directed acyclic graphs. That means if you follow the direction of the arrows, you will never have a cycle in the sense that you will never return to the same point from where you started. So that's a directed acyclic graph. So in these neural networks, you will always have a structure like this. Now what is happening here is that we have these inputs, and on top of that we have these, we multiply all of them with the weight matrix W1, right. So let's say this is x times W1, and then we pass it through some nonlinear function which pointwise computes a nonlinearity. So what does this mean? If we have a sigma times W1x, that doesn't mean that this is a scalar, this is not a scalar, it's a vector, but sigma is a scalar function which is applied pointwise to each element of that vector, and the output is treated as a vector of the same dimension as that of the input to the function, right. And then we will use that. So basically this is your sigma times W1x or g times W1x, right, and then we have W2, and what we get finally is your y is a vector here, y is equal to f times W2 times So it's matrix multiplication with a let's try to write it in a single line. So y is equal to f times w2 times g times g of w1 times x. Okay, so y is f of w2 times g of w1x. So this is layer 1, this is layer 2. Okay. So what is this first layer doing? We know that inside that sigmoid function g we have a linear function which is w1 times x. So that linear function with a sigmoid function is actually dividing the input space defined by x1 and x2 and x3 into 3 different half spaces, 3 different pairs of half spaces. This is the division of in half space 1, this is in half space 2, and this is in half space 3. So what that means is we are drawing some hyperplanes on the x1, x2, x3 space using 3 different hidden neurons, and based on that we are dividing the left side and the right side of those half spaces and treating that as a new feature for the output. So with that we are introducing nonlinearity. So let's say we want to classify, we want to find a boundary between all the positive and the negative points in this particular example. So we have a bunch of positive points here, we have a bunch of positive points here, and then we have one positive point here, and then we have a whole bunch of negative points. So we have negative points here, negative points here, and negative points here. So obviously a single neuron that shows you this boundary will not be able to classify between the positive and negative samples. And so this single line is what is the decision boundary of logistic regression. This boundary can shift left or right if we have a different threshold than compared to 0.5, but what will happen is essentially it's going to be a line, it's going to be a hyperplane of n-1 dimensions in an n-dimensional space. But we don't want a hyperplane, we want nonlinear classification. So what we are doing is that we are introducing a hidden layer. The hidden layer is dividing, each neuron of the hidden layer is dividing the input space into half spaces using these hyperplanes, right. So basically the hidden layer, each of these line represents one neuron of the first hidden layer. So what's a hidden layer? Hidden layer is, so if you have the inputs, you have hidden layers, and then you have the output layer. Right, so this is your output layer. So this is your hidden layer. So this hidden layer, each neuron is basically dividing the input space into 2 half spaces, the positive and the negative half spaces, and combinations thereof can now be used by the next layer to do a finer division of the input space to find out the positive spaces and the negative spaces. Now these spaces are not going to be defined by a single line but by combinations of lines because of the hidden layer. So that hidden layer basically gives you these combinations of lines. So that's how you can model more complicated functions, but keep that in mind that whenever you want to model more complicated functions, it should be justified by a larger data, because more complicated functions on small data just leads to overfitting, and it should be verified by a rigorous validation process or cross validation process. So that those kind of logics still apply to neural networks, but we are introducing these hidden layers to basically model more complicated functions. Now let's take another way of visualizing these what these hidden layers are doing, right. So what we looked at earlier was, let's say we are doing regression, right. So let's say we have x, right, and we have t, and what we are given are a bunch of training points which are forming some smooth function, and we want to find f of x which comes as close to these points as possible. Now if your f of x is a constant, it's nothing, but then what we will get is basically just a line that I can move up or down, and how close it comes to all of these points is anyone's guess, and that's not a very useful function. So now let's look at another function which is this f of x is equal to w1x plus w0, right. So that particular function can be any kind of a line, and the line that comes closest to all the points in a mean square sense is probably the line that I will go with, and that's one kind of a function that I can model, right. So that doesn't come very close to, that may not come very close to some interesting set of points that you see here. So now what I can do is I can take one level further, and I can say that I want to model this as w1 phi 1 of x plus w2 phi 2 of x, okay, plus b. So what is phi 1 phi 2? These could be powers of x, or these could be Fourier features of x and so forth, some fixed set of features. So what I am saying is that I have this line and I have this parabola. Take a linear combination of these two, and based on the linear combination I can move the parabola up and down, right, using b, and I can move the parabola left and right using x, and based on that I can get any kind of a parabola, right. So I can get, let's say I can get some parabola that fits these points. So that is the fixed feature extraction that we can do, that can try to come close to these lines, to these points. Then comes support vector regression. In support vector regression, let's take the kernelized form, where we are going to say is that f of x is basically sum over I is the number of training points, I is the index over training points, and we are going to take kernel of xi, right, and these are only those that belong to the support vectors, and then basically we are going to have some weight wi and then plus b. I'll skip the plus b part. So what that is saying is that we will find some points that are support vectors. On those points we are going to have kernels, and then we will take a linear combination of these kernels. So we will either bump one of these kernels up or one of these kernels down, but the location, the center location of the kernels cannot change. The center location of the kernels can only occur at one of the training points, okay, and then I can have some sort of a combination of these that may come closer to the points that I have. So that's your support vector regression, and similarly we have support vector classification. Now let's take another example where what we want to do now is we want to use a neural network. Okay. So in neural networks we will fit some sort of a kernel function or some sort of a basis function, right. We can we can have a basis function, but the location of the basis function need not be at a training point, it can move anywhere, and we can have the number of basis functions that we will use is a hyperparameter that we can change. So let's take a basis function. I can have one that is here and one that is like here, so this may not even be at a training point, and I can add actually finer and finer number of basis functions, and I can stitch them all together by appropriate weights by bumping them up or down, and then I can have a very good approximation of the function that I am trying to model. Now how do I shift them left or right is by using the biases of the hidden layer. How do I bump them up or down is by using the weights of the second layer, okay, and how do I change other things about it is by using different kinds of weights and biases in the two layers. So now let's be more specific. Now let's use sigmoid, since we promised sigmoid, right. So basically what we are saying is that let's say we have a sigmoid, we have multiple sigmoids, right, and whether they are positive sigmoids or negative sigmoids depends on whether the weights are positive or negative for that particular hidden unit, right, that particular hidden neuron, and their how fast they rise and where they are located, whether they are left or right, or whether they rise smoothly or they rise very fast. That depends on the weights and the biases of the neural network. So based on that we can, and then their final weights are basically what we get in the weights of the final layer. So the heights of these different sigmoids are going to be the weights of the second layer, whereas how fast they rise are going to be the weights of the first layer, or the mod of the weights of the first layer, the L2 norm of the weights of the first layer, and their where they are located, where their central point is, that is the biases of the first layer, and then overall how much further up I can raise the whole thing or lower it down, that is the bias of the second layer. So that is, that's how you can think about these, but we have actually more flexibility than choosing just sigmoids. We will see that in a bit, but the idea is that we can use a combination, a repeated combination of a canonical function by shifting it left or right, by stretching it in the x direction, by stretching it in the y direction, but the shape doesn't change. We just stretch it or move it around, add it up, multiple versions of these things up, and we get an arbitrarily smooth function that can touch any sets of points or come very close to them, and we can get better and better approximation. Again, we don't want to have too good of an approximation if we don't have the data to justify it. That will lead to overfitting, but those kind of things can be tested by looking at how the validation works out. So all this comes from the universal approximation theorem by Sabenko and some of his colleagues or contemporaries at that point. Basically this theorem suggests that if we have a smooth function, right, if we have a smooth function sigma which is not a polynomial, right, and we have a compact interval. So let's take x. What is a compact interval? Let's say I draw some lower limit and upper limit, and these are not like limits that go into infinity, these are finite limits. So this is within some boundaries a and b, that is a compact. Within this compact I can have any function, right, I can have any function f of x provided it is a well behaved function. What is a well behaved function? It is a smooth function, let us say, its derivatives are finite and the second derivative is finite and so forth, or it could be continuous in the Lipschitz sense that I can draw a cone at any point with finite slope and the function will lie within the cone for any point within a and b. So it could be something along those lines, and I have a lot of flexibility in choosing sigma, this nonlinear function that I will move around using W1 and that I will bump up or down using W2, and I can put this in this particular layered form where there is only one layer, and the only flexibility that I want is that I can increase one of the dimensions of W and the corresponding dimensions of W2, the dimensions of W1 and W2 that match together. So if x is of dimension, let us say d cross 1, then W1 can be of dimension, let us say h cross d, right, and your output let us say is 1, then it is your W2 is going to be of dimension 1 cross h. So this h is my hyperparameter. So the number of hidden neurons in the first layer is my hyperparameter. I can change that around. If I am allowed to increase it, it is a positive integer, if I am allowed to increase it arbitrarily, then I can come within an epsilon error, plus minus epsilon error of the function fx using just this particular form for any function fx, provided it is not discontinuous and it does not have infinite derivatives and so forth. So just that's it. We don't have to specify sigma to be a sigmoid function. It can actually be any kind of function. It can be Gaussian, it can be rectified linear unit which is 0 on one side and identity on the other side of origin and so forth. Okay. So what that means is that I can, so if you think about it a little bit more carefully, let me change the color here. all I need to do is take this sigma and basically divide this into small intervals, very small intervals, right? And within small intervals, so let's say my sigma is nothing but a step function, not a step function, a pulse function, right? I can move this sigma around and I can place it anywhere, right? How can I place it anywhere? I can place it anywhere by changing the bias in the W1 matrix, assuming X also has a 1, and I can move it around by changing the weights of W, right? And the other thing that I can do is the finer tessellation means I will need more such pulses, and more pulses means I will need more hidden neurons, right? So that will more finer tessellation of that space, and depending on how fast, what is the maximum rise in any interval, right? So and then what's its relation to epsilon error, that error tolerance that I want, based on that I will need finer or coarser tessellation of this space. That means I will need more or less hidden neurons, but I can arbitrarily come close to this yellow function using a sum of shifted pulses. I can come close to them using shifted sigmoids, shifted Gaussians. I can come close to it using pairs of positive and negative sigmoids to create like Gaussian type effect. So I have a positive sigmoid and I have a negative sigmoid. If I add the two up or subtract the two, I can and add a bias, I can create a function like this, right? So I have different choices of this nonlinear function. It just has to be nonlinear. It cannot be linear. It cannot be an identity function. Otherwise, I don't get this, and it cannot be polynomial either. We will not get into the proof, but then for a wide range of functions, I can model arbitrarily close to it. I'm not guaranteed what's going to happen outside the interval. So outside the interval I don't know what's going to happen, but for a compact interval I can assure that I will be able to model any function. Now we can generalize it to n dimensions. We can threshold this function and do classification. So if we don't threshold it, it's regression. If we threshold it, it's classification. So there are all sorts of possibilities that come out of this universal approximation theorem. Then there are generalizations of this universal approximation theorem, where we can even increase the number of neurons. So we can have features. The first layer is a feature extractor, then we have features of features, then features of features of features, and so forth. And based on that, our modeling power keeps on increasing. So actually we just need a neural network with a single hidden layer, just that the number of hidden neurons can be very, very large for complicated functions such as image recognition, and for such functions it might be better to simplify some of it by introducing layers. So coming back to what is the single neuron is doing, so let's say if we have x1 and x2 space, right, depending on the weights we are basically finding some sort of a boundary that has a negative half space and a positive half space, and we are elevating one side of the boundary and we are depressing the other side of boundary if our nonlinear squashing function is a sigmoid function. Okay. Another closely related function is a tan H function. Let's look at that carefully. Now the other thing is that we need a smoother transition between the two, because we will be doing gradient descent, and we don't like zero gradients. We like at least some finite gradient, so that we have a direction or about where to move. So these are some popular activation functions. So you are already familiar with this step function, which is not very useful, right? And then we have the sigmoid, which is an approximation, smooth approximation of the step function. The derivative is never truly zero, so we have a direction, we get some direction on how to adjust the weights. So we like using sigmoid function. A very similar function is a tan H function, which instead of going from 0 to 1 will go from -1 to +1 on the left asymptote and the right asymptote. Another very useful function is the rectified linear function. So this is the rectified linear function. So it's 0 on the negative side and its identity on the positive side, and although we have 0 derivative here on the negative side, we are not too worried about it, is because we assume that for at least half the number of input samples, the output computed will be on the right hand side and we will get some derivative. There are some advantages of using the ReLU activation function, is that it is easier to train than sigmoid, because on one side the derivative never becomes very small, although even in sigmoid theoretically the derivative is never 0, but it becomes very small when we go towards an extreme away from the origin. So here, at least for half the inputs, for ReLU the derivative will always be finite, and it has been practically seen that neural networks with the ReLU activation function converge faster, and they give slightly higher accuracy in many practical cases. So basically what ReLU is doing with a single hidden layer, it's, if you have any function, it's trying to map it with some combinations of ReLUs. So you shift these ReLUs left and right, or you flip them around by turning the weights negative, or you increase their slope by increasing the mod of the weights and so forth. But you take many of these and you add them up in the second layer and with different weights, and then what we get is some sort of a piecewise linear approximation of the function that we are trying to model. So it's basically doing this piecewise linear approximation of the function. Another quite useful activation is to do no activation, which is linear, which is identity, and that is what is used in the final layer or in the second layer of a regression neural network, because we want to be able to model so let's say if your y is equal to fx and this y is not a probability. If it was a probability, then it's going to be between 0 and 1, and for that the final layer activation is usually sigmoid or a generalization of that, which is softmax. But for regression tasks, sometimes we want y to have a large range from negative infinity to plus infinity. So in that case the last layer will have no activation, or what is called linear activation. So for a regression net we will have linear activation. For classification nets we will have softmax and sigmoids. Sigmoid for binary classification, softmax for n-ary classification. It's a generalization over sigmoid. But for the hidden layers we can either have tanh, or we can have sigmoid, or we can have ReLU. The preferred one is ReLU, rectified linear unit. So these are the equations for all of these. The step function is just a theoretical construct, we don't use it. It's sine of x plus 1 by half, right? And then you have sigmoid, which is the logistic regression type of a function. Then we have tanh, which is simply tanh, which basically acts as sigmoid stretched 2 times and then shifted down by 1. And then we have ReLU, which is just max of 0 and x, right? And then we have softmax, which if you take I is equal to 2, it takes the form very similar to sigmoid. It's basically just a 2-dimension or 3-dimension or n-dimension generalization over sigmoid. In sigmoid it is assumed that the output of one classes is 1, for the other class it is e to the power x, whereas here we are computing it for all different classes. If we have more than 2 classes, then we don't take one class as a relative class, we just take all of them. And then we have linear activation, which is just simply identity function. It does nothing to the output. Notice that this is only for the output layer of a regression neural network. It is not to be used in the hidden layers. In the hidden layers you want to use any of these functions, okay, and the preferred one to be used is ReLU. And there are situations where you don't use ReLU, but those we will leave that for deeper neural networks, for deep learning when we get to that. So we have already seen what is a sigmoid. It's a smooth transition of the step function, and although I mentioned that ReLU is to be used for hidden units, we have to keep it in mind that it usually does not give us a meaningful output. It gives us a meaningful division of the input space, but it does not give us a meaningful output. So it is usually not used for the output of a neural network unless you have a very specific reason that you want to restrict, you want to squash all the negative outputs to just 0. And tan H is similar to sigmoid, and it is used for modeling outputs between -1 and +1, usually -1 being negative and +1 being positive, and the intermediate range is to allow for the transition and gradient descent. Softmax is an used for NRE classification. Linear is used for the final layer of the regression. Okay. So now what we can do with these neural networks, we can take inputs and we need not have a single hidden layer, we can actually add multiple hidden layers before we get to the output. Okay. So such a neural network has, let's say, 2 hidden layers and a final output layer. So this has it has 3 sets of weights. You have a set of weights here, you have a set of weights here, and you have a set of weights here. So you have 3 weight matrices in this particular neural network, and you can keep increasing. We can have actually more than 2 layers also. For now we will just study a single hidden layer. The problem what happens when you increase the number of layers is that you get too many parameters and you get something called gradient dilution that we will study a little later. So, but the basic structure of the neural network is the following, that you will have a set of inputs. Inputs will be passed on to the next layer. They will not come back, they will not pass information to each other, they will just pass information to the next layer. That next layer will pass information to the next layer, and that will pass information to the final layer that will compute the output. Okay. So within this you have a bunch of hyperparameters. So for example, how many layers, how many So the obvious answer to this is that you need at least 1 hidden layer to model anything nonlinear. Okay, so you need at least 1 hidden layer. And then what is the dimension of the input layer? How many neurons in the input layer? That is easy. That is just that you will have as many, the dimension will be same as the dimension of the input. What is the dimension of the output layer? That is also easy. That it is the same as the number of outputs. So if you have 3 classes, then you will have 3 outputs. If you have 3-dimensional regression, then you will have 3 outputs and so forth. So the input and the output dimension is fixed. The number of hidden layers is something that you have control over, and that's your hyperparameter. Then within each hidden layer, the number of neurons or the dimension of that layer, the dimension of each hidden layer, is also a hyperparameter. Okay. And then what we have is we have a feed forward structure where information only goes from one layer to the next layer. It's not exchanged within the layer, it doesn't come back to the layer, it doesn't skip layers. Okay. No skipping, no lateral connections, all right, no backward connections. Everything is one layer forward. That's why it's a layered structure. Okay. That's why it has that functional form where one function is nested inside another function, is nested inside another function, is nested inside another function. Okay, so your output layer will represent the output of the neural network. So if you have a 2-class output, you will need only one layer, one output neuron. Sometimes you need more than one. If you have more than one outputs, okay, your input layer represents the number of inputs that you have from in your data. Okay, and then you will have just one such layer, and then the number of hidden layers is where you play with the structure of the neural network. You can increase the number of hidden layers, you can increase the number of neurons in each layer, and so forth. So how do we train this? How do we train this neural network? So essentially we train it using gradient descent. Is what we had seen about gradient descent. I will just quickly recap. So let's say you have a function and I want to find the maximum of that function. So you can see that here the slope of the function is positive, so the maximum lies to the right side. Here the slope of the function is negative, so the maximum lies to the left hand side. So at a particular function, if I don't know the form of the function, but I can compute its point value and its point derivative, then I know I need to go right to reach the maximum. Okay. So I will take a small step to the right and then recompute the function and its derivative. If the derivative is still positive, I will keep going to the right. Here if the derivative is negative, I will keep going to the negative right side, which is the left side, and I will keep going until my gradient is 0. Then I have reached the top of the mountain, and in gradient descent we take a step towards the negative side of the gradient. So if we have a loss function and we want to minimize it, we will compute its derivative, right, and we will take a function and a step towards the negative side of the derivative. So here at this point, if the derivative is positive, then I will go left. Here if the derivative is negative, then I will go right until I reach this point. So that is gradient descent. And the derivative of so these derivatives can be computed for vector functions also. For now we were looking at only scalar functions. In scalar functions means that your output is only one dimensional, f of x is only one dimensional. So let's take the example when you have f of x is equal to ax square plus bx plus c, your derivative is 2ax plus b and your double derivative is 2a. So what these tell us is that if this blue curve is the function f of x, then my derivative is going to be this red line, and my second derivative is going to be this horizontal green line that you see here, right. For the convex parabola, here we have a concave parabola and everything reverses its sign. So if I want to find the minima or the maxima, then basically I will equate the derivative to 0, which is where this red line is crossing the x axis. So you can see from the red line basically whether you need to take a step in the right direction or in the left direction for gradient descent or gradient ascent. Okay. Now when we go to multiple dimensions, so let's say we have x1 and x2, then we will not have just parabolas, we will have bowls or paraboloids, and here we are looking at derivative in two different directions, which becomes the gradient vector, and then we can take a step based on the gradient vector. So if I draw the contours of this parabola, it may look like this, and at any particular point in this particular loss function surface, I will compute the derivative, and that derivative basically will point me in the direction of largest increase, and to do a gradient descent I will have to take a step in the negative of that direction, a small step in the negative direction. I will reach here, then another small step, etc., etc., and after some iterations I might reach the bottom of this bowl. Okay, so here's an example of a gradient. So here we have two different inputs, x1 and x2, two different it's a function of two different variables. So in the x1 x2 space, in neural networks it's going to be w1 and w2, not x1 and x2. x1 and x2 are the training inputs, those are going to be fixed, but here just for the function we have x1 and x2. We can take the derivative and we will get these two, we will get a vector like this, and we can compute it for a particular point, and this direction, so this direction is basically the unit vector. I computed the derivative at point x1 is equal to 2 and x2 is equal to 1. I got 20 and 6. If I convert it into a unit vector, then I will get a unit direction, and that direction tells me where will I step for maximum increase. If I want to go to the bottom of this, I will go in the negative of this direction. Okay. So this story that is folding in multiple dimensions is that we have at any particular point we will go in the negative direction, and then we will reach a new contour, then another negative direction will reach a new contour, and so forth, and ultimately we will reach the bottom. If we take too large of a step, then we will basically be doing some bouncing around. So let me take a different color. For large steps, if our eta is large, then we will be bouncing around until we reach the bottom, and if eta is too large, then we might actually go so far out that we will go outside this contour and we will actually diverge, we will increase the loss value or the function value, and that is also not desirable, right. So all these concepts are applicable to neural networks as well, and we try to make that computation more efficient using something called the backpropagation algorithm. So we will take this in the next segment of this module, where we will go into backpropagation algorithm and see how it is applied to neural networks. Thank you.